This morning, I'd like you to turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 5. It's been a couple of weeks, but if you remember last time, Israel went out to battle and they were defeated by the Philistines. They asked a couple of questions. They said, "Why has the Lord defeated us?" And then they came to the wrong conclusion. They thought, well, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant out to battle. And if you remember, they said that it may save us from the Philistines. And trusting in that emblem, they were defeated, and the Philistines have now conquered Israel, and they've taken the Ark of the Covenant. To Israel, that was the throne of God. It was the representation of his presence. It was a very difficult time for them. They might have wondered if God had left them, or if God's throne had been removed, because that was where they considered God's throne to be. It was his presence. And remember, we talked about the Ark of the Covenant, that golden box in which were the 10 Commandments, the staff of Aaron, and the jar of manna. Those things that represented God's presence and his covenant with the people. Well, that's gone. Over that box was that golden lid called the mercy seat. And that's where the priest would sprinkle the blood of the lamb between the presence of God and his covenant. That was the grace of God. And that had been taken. And the Philistines now have it in their territory, but we can trust that God will never be dethroned. He's still on the throne. And God is going to wipe out the Philistines. He's going to plague them and judge them, and he's going to hit them where it hurts. He's going to kick their butts, most literally. Let's read in 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1. It says, "Then the Philistines took the ark of God, and they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod." Ashdod was the place of their temple for their deity, Dagon. They worshipped kind of a merman, kind of a Poseidon. They were seafaring people, these Philistines. They had emigrated from the island of Crete. They weren't Semitic, they weren't from that area, but being that they were connected to the Western world, they had technology that really put Israel in defense. They had entered into the Iron Age, and so they had weapons, and they were renowned for their fighting. And they worshiped this half-man, half-fish god. And the bottom half was scales and a tail, and the top half was a man with his hands held out, and he had that sort of Phoenician-looking beard, and they had a temple in Ashdod. They had 5 main cities, these Philistines. And being organized by these cities, they were able to marshal forces for war better than the Philistines, better than the Israelis, which were spread out and agrarian. And so they posed a real threat to Israel. And without the help of God, the Philistines would always dominate. And among their 5 cities, they had another city that you may remember from your Bible stories, the city of Gath. And at this time, in Gath was a family that you might be familiar with. There was probably just a young boy at that time, but he was a big boy. His name was Goliath. And growing in Gath was these giants that really posed a threat to Israel. And yet here they've captured the emblem of God's presence, and they've now put it in their temple as a trophy of war. But God is not defeated. And it says there, when the Philistines took the ark of God, verse 2, they brought it into the house of Dagon, and they set it by Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early in the morning, there was Dagon, fallen on its face to the earth. Notice it says fallen on its face, not his face, because it's just an idol. And it was fallen on its face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and they set it in its place again. By the way, if you're worshiping a God that you have to pick up and prop up and lean up, you got the wrong God. We don't have to carry our God around, he carries us. We don't have to prop him up, he props us up. We don't have to hold him up, our God holds us up. And so Dagon had fallen on his face. It probably looked like he was bowing down before the God of Israel. So when the people of Ashdod, verse 3 continues, arose early in the morning, there was Dagon, fallen on its face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon, set it in its place again. And when they arose the next morning early, there was Dagon, again, fallen on its face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were broken off on the threshold. Only Dagon's torso was left of it. Therefore, the priests of Dagon, nor any who come into Dagon's house, that temple, they tread on the threshold of Dagon, which is in Ashdod to this day. It's interesting here. The second day they come in, And here Dagon's lost his head. He's lost his hands. God showing symbolically that he has total power over this idol. I just wonder what they thought when they went in the morning. And this time, the head had rollen off, and it looked like it was on the threshold of the door that went in. You got to wonder what they did with the ark of God. When they got it, they knew that, to them, they must have thought, these Hebrews, they got a weak God. They worship a box. What is that? They probably opened it up. And in it, they saw those tablets of stone which had God's law on it. You will have no other gods before me. All of those commandments that God gave. And they probably made no sense of it, but after the second day, you would think maybe they would have a second thought about worshiping this dumb idol, this foolish merman that they had. But rather than turning their hearts, you notice that, it says here that they began a tradition that they would no longer step on the threshold. This was kind of like, remember when you were kids and you'd walk along the sidewalk and you'd say, if you step on a crack, you break your dad's back. We'd add to it, if you step on a line, you break your mom's spine. It was just silly, silly stuff. But in this little snapshot, we have human nature. When confronted with the true and living God, these people don't turn their hearts. Rather than having obedience, they adopt some stupid superstition. I'm amazed how people love superstition. They love ceremony, things that you can do on the outside, but it doesn't really affect the inside. In fact, the sad thing about this is hundreds of years later, one of the prophets to the nation of Israel rebuked them about this very thing because the Israelis had adopted the same superstition. When they would come in, they would jump over the threshold. And God says to them, I will destroy those who leap over the threshold, but who are bringing violence and deceit into their house. Isn't it amazing how human beings can wander so far from God in spirit and in heart, and yet at the same time keep up all of their traditions, all of their superstitions, all of these things? Well, the Philistines are an example of that. God had destroyed their idol, and yet they follow a superstition. But God's not done with them. Notice what it says in verse 6. But the hand of the Lord was heavy on the people of Ashdod, and he ravaged them and struck them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. So the surrounding villages and the people within the city were struck with tumors. Now that's a generous word. The old King James translate this word with an old word, emerods. Emerods is the ancient word for hemorrhoids. And as we get to 1 Samuel 5, it's one of the more funny chapters in the Bible. It tells us that God has a sense of humor. What he struck them with was some kind of plague, bubonic plague or something, where they began to break out with hemorrhoids. Now, it tells us in verse 9, one of the older translations, it says at the end of verse 9, and tumors or emerods or hemorrhoids broke out on them. The old version says he smote them in their secret parts. You can almost imagine what it was like for the Philistines to go out in the morning. How you doing? I'm all right. I'm not doing so well. What's wrong with you? I've got hemorrhoids. So do I. God was kicking their butts. Now, the Septuagint, which is the old Greek translation of the Hebrew that was done a few hundred years BC, it adds here that God struck them with mice as well. And you'll find that in chapter 6, which we'll cover this morning, that there were rats in the land. So this corresponds with the judgment that God gave, that there were rats in the land. About 100 years ago, some archaeologists in Israel were digging up Ashdod, and they found a strange layer of this black surface, and it was 9 centimeters of rat's bones. And they dated this to 1050 BC, this very time. So archaeology has actually dug up the historic fact of this, that they had a plague there, that it was horrible. Now, there was a Jewish man about 100 years ago named Louis Ginsburg. And after studying rabbinic literature and all of the Talmud and the Midrash and all of these things, he wrote a book called The Legends of the Jews. And this is stories. They're not necessarily accurate. Some of them are fanciful, but he will comment on this section and he gives some grotesque details about what it was. He says, the hand of God lay heavy on the Philistines and a plague raged among them. So their bodies were covered in sores and mice came up from the earth in great numbers and devoured their entrails while they were yet alive. The sores were of the nature of hemorrhoids, and the pain was so great that the Philistines could neither stand nor sit. So he even goes on to describe that when they would go out into the field to use the bathroom, the rats were jumping and eating their... You get the picture, I don't need to tell you. Listen, God knows how to defend himself. God knows how to defend himself. Sometimes do you ever feel that you need to jump in there and defend God, or when somebody's blaspheming or doing something? Hey, he knows how to take care of himself. And even when his own people aren't faithful, Israel wasn't walking with the Lord as they should have. They were living kind of with that mentality of the book of Judges where it says that the people did what was right in their own eyes. They were doing what was right in their own eyes.